Hi, the goal of this is to try to give you an opportunity to be exposed to some introductory terms for comparative politics that we will be using throughout the trimester. As I talked about before, comparative politics and international relations are both branches of political science. In comparative politics, we focus on the study and comparison of domestic politics like elections, political parties, revolutions, judicial systems, how the executive functions, whether or not they have a parliament or a Congress and what their powers are, etc., across countries. Whereas in international relations, you focus on the relations between countries, like foreign policy, war, trade, and foreign aid. It's important to understand that even though these two branches of political science have different focuses, they do overlap, and we're not going to look at comparative politics in an isolated bubble. So, for example, it would be difficult to study the domestic politics of Mexico without looking at the effects of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. So even though NAFTA is a trade agreement signed between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and that would clearly be foreign policy, it's had a pretty significant impact on the economics and the domestic politics of Mexico. As a matter of fact, revolution with the Zapatistas was started on the day of the first day of the treaty. I mean, so it has done a lot to affect the domestic politics. So it would be ridiculous to study the domestic politics of Mexico and exclude NAFTA. Similarly, we're going to be looking at the United Kingdom. Recently, the United Kingdom had a vote on Brexit, whether or not to leave the European Union, and it did pass. However, that is about foreign policy, but it was very motivated by domestic politics within England. And so we would look at, for example, how the EU will be affected by the UK leaving, and how the UK will be affected by the UK leaving, and sort of like how it affects the domestic politics within the United Kingdom. So I think it's important to understand that there are aspects of foreign policy that we will cover this trimester, even though we are focusing on comparative politics. As political scientists, it's important to look at the difference between correlation and causation. When two variables are correlated, there's an apparent association between them, but the nature of the relationship is unclear. An example of this that your textbook talks about in Chapter 1 is the fact that most Western industrialized democracies happen to also be some of the most developed countries in the world. However, your book stops short of saying that there is a causal relationship, because there isn't a clear relationship, and we as political scientists can't point to what is the thing. Is it democracy that leads to that? Not necessarily, because there are other democracies in the world, but that aren't doing as well economically. And so, they have an interesting discussion about that. So when we're comparing things between two different countries, it gives us an opportunity to look at whether or not something is a correlative factor or a causative factor. Because if it's causation, then it should do it in more than one place. I have seen on AP exams in the short answer section questions on correlation versus causation. And so it is important to be able to look at a research statement and figure out whether or not it is making a claim about it being a correlation or a causation. As political scientists, we use both qualitative and quantitative research methods. Comparativists use these as well. So qualitative research approaches would be interviewing people, doing observation, archival, and other forms of documentary research. So an example of a comparativist using qualitative research would be if the political scientists went to Mexico and interviewed democracy activists about what they were working for in Mexico, what type of pushback they got from the government, what types of human rights abuses they were experiencing, what types of human rights abuses they were documenting, and then also similarly went and did interviews with democracy activists in Russia, and then asked them the same types of questions, and then they could make comparisons between the way that people are organizing for democracy in both countries. Qualitative research is narrowly focused, and it's a deep investigation of one or a few case studies drawing from scholarly expertise, and it uses inductive reasoning. Quantitative research is different. It's more like number crunching, and it uses a wider amount of cases, and it's unbound by area specialization. A lot of the data that you're going to read about in the development article and the globalization article really sort of lends itself to this type of quantitative research, in that it looks at, like, comparing GDP, it looks at comparing birth and death rates, it looks at comparing like education rates, but it uses statistical analysis and mathematical models in order to be able to compare different parts of the world, different types of governments, etc. And quantitative research would use deductive reasoning. It's important to understand that a key part of being a political scientist in comparative politics is that we try to make empirical statements and try to stay away from making judgments about other societies. Our focus is to compare governments and politics between countries as opposed to judge governments and politics. So, for example, empirical statements are objective and factual. So an example of an empirical statement would be that before 1991, Iraq had one of the highest rates of literacy and education levels for women in the Middle East. That would be an objective and factual statement. A normative statement would have subjective or value-based judgments in it. So a normative statement about the same topic would be that Iraq is now a more backwards country because their education rates for women have fallen. Like, that would be a normative statement because that would be making a judgment call. I see pretty frequently on the AP exam an opportunity for students in the short answer section to identify whether or not something is an empirical statement or a normative statement, or to look at a chart and make an empirical statement and a normative statement about the data in that chart, and then to explain why, as a comparativist, we would want to make empirical statements and not normative statements. Some of the things that I think are the most confusing for students when they start studying comparative politics is the fact that terms like state, regime, government, nation, country don't necessarily mean the same thing for political scientists that they mean when you just read them in the newspaper. And part of that has to do with the fact that, like, words have multiple meanings, but part of it has to do with the fact that political scientists use these terms to try to mean things that are more specific than what people do when they're talking about them in the news. So when we say the word state here in the United States of America, we are frequently talking about a political subdivision, like the state of Minnesota. However, political scientists, when they say the word state, they are talking about the organization which maintains a monopoly of power over a territory. Okay? So if we look over here, this is the state of Israel. Okay? All of this is the state of Israel. Israel controls, using power, and has a monopoly of power over this whole territory. Okay? Sovereignty is another key term. In order for a state to exist, it has to have what is called sovereignty. Sovereignty is the ability to carry out actions independent of rivals. So if we look at Israel, they have lots of rivals in the area. They've had tenuous relationships with Egypt, with Lebanon. They definitely have tenuous relationships with Syria and with trying to keep the Syrian civil war from spilling over. They have tenuous relationships with Jordan, sometimes with Saudi Arabia. But the idea is that they get to control what happens within their border, and they get to control what happens within their airspace. They get to control what happens here in the ocean that borders them. But the idea of sovereignty is that they get to carry out actions independent of rivals, and they do not need to ask for their permission. Okay? A regime is a word that you hear frequently in the news, and the news likes to use the word regime to talk about a country that we don't necessarily like. So in the news you hear them talk about the North Korean regime or the Syrian regime. But I think it's important to understand that political scientists don't necessarily use the term regime as a judgment-based term. Okay? A regime is defined as the fundamental rules and norms of politics. Like, a regime embodies long-term goals that guide the state with regard to individual freedom and collective equality, where power should reside and how power should be used. And so a regime could be a democratic regime, but also a regime could be a non-democratic regime. okay? In the United States, we frequently refer to a regime as a leader, okay? But I think it's important to understand that a regime isn't inherently negative. It more means that there are norms and rules, okay? And what it's trying to get at is that a regime is more than just like a leader, right? Like, so who is the leader of Iran doesn't matter as much as the fact that the Iranian regime has its own traditions and norms of how it operates. Same with the United States. And so, like, when political scientists are talking about the word regime, they're trying to get at the fact that it's more than just this one person being in charge, okay? Government is a term that political scientists use to talk about the fact that it's the leadership that runs the state. So the terms government and state are related, okay? So state is the fact that this whole geographic area is controlled by a government which has sovereignty, okay? So these terms are all related to each other. So the Israeli government, right, runs the state. There's a prime minister, there's a parliament, okay? Now the term nation is more complicated. And the reason why I chose Israel as my example here is because Israel has a nation within it, okay? This area right here is called the Gaza Strip. This area right here is called the West Bank. Now, there are Palestinians that live throughout this area that is called Israel, but most Palestinians live in these two concentrated areas, okay? And they are a nation. They have a defined history. They have a defined language, right? They speak Arabic. They share two common religions. Most Palestinians are Muslim and Christian. And they share a common history, okay? But what they don't have is sovereignty, in that this territory, although it is called the Palestinian territories or the West Bank and Gaza, they do not have sovereignty over it. They are within the state of Israel. And at the end of the day, Israel gets to decide who gets to enter the territory, who gets to leave the territory, who gets to fly over the territory, what goods get to come in and out. Like the Palestinians are having a conflict that's been longstanding for over 50 years with the Israelis over the fact that they would like sovereignty. But the fact of the matter is that they do not have a state. There is not a Palestinian state. That is actually what their whole argument is about, is the fact that they would like there to be a Palestinian state. But so the United States, for example, has nations within it. Like, for example, there are lots of Native American nations within the United States that have limited types of sovereignty within the United States, and that they have some jurisdiction over and control over their territory. But the fact of the matter is that they aren't a state. Like, there aren't Native American states within the United States of America. Okay? The last term I wanted to cover is this idea of country. Country is shorthand for the combined political entities defined so far of regimes, state, and government. So like in the news, they'll use the word country, or like a political scientist could use the word country as like shorthand. But I think it's important to understand that political scientists prefer to use terms like state, regime, government, because they are more politically specific than using terms like country. And part of that has to do with the fact that there can be nations within governments, and not and that there are sort of different relationships between these terms. So within a state, and it has a government, different types of governments have different types of legitimacy. And I think that's an important term to understand. Legitimacy can be defined as a value whereby people recognize and accept something or someone as right and proper. There are different types of legitimacy. So traditional legitimacy is by habit and custom over time, and it stresses history, and it's strongly institutionalized. And so like the monarch of a country would have traditional legitimacy, that they would get to rule because they were related to this group of rulers. So for example, the British Crown is an example of a family that has had traditional legitimacy. Now, when we talk about the UK as a part of this unit, one of the things we're going to talk about is the fact that they have a constitutional monarchy. So even though they have a monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, She is not actually the leader of Great Britain. That's actually the Prime Minister. But still, the British family, the British royal crown, still has that legitimacy because of tradition. In many authoritarian dictatorships, you have a leader who has legitimacy because they are charismatic, or they have charismatic legitimacy. And they have this because of the force of their ideas and the presence of the leader. But what happens is that presence is very tied to that particular person, and it's weakly institutionalized, which means that after they are no longer, after they, die, then there's frequently a scrambling for power because the next person who, is in charge of the country doesn't per se have that charismatic leadership because they weren't the person who was built up to be, the leader. Frequently around a charismatic, to create this charismatic legitimacy, frequently a government would set up like a cult of personality around a leader. Lastly, particularly in democracies, we have what are called rational legal legitimacy, which is where the legitimacy is built on rules and procedures and the offices that create and enforce those rules, and it's strongly institutionalized. So, for example, in the United States, we currently have an elected executive, Barack Obama. He was elected by the popular vote, then it was solidified by the Electoral College. He was then inaugurated, where, for example, he was sworn in by the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He has given speeches to Congress. We all act like he's in charge because we have this rational legal legitimacy that we have in the United States. The cartoon is dealing with the fact that in a country like Egypt, they have had some problems with legitimacy because they've had leaders who've been put in power and then taken out of power. And so the cartoon is an example of Morsi, who's been beheaded in the cartoon by the military, saying, "I'm still the legitimate president of Egypt." And the cartoonist is trying to draw attention to the fact that, it's not whether or not the leader says that they're legitimate, it's whether or not the country itself thinks that you're legitimate. The last thing we're going to do today is to look at, so within a state, you get to have an organized government, and there are lots of different choices of what types of governments to have. And today's activity we're going to end with is from Callie Casper. She's a fellow comparative politics teacher from another state, and she's developed an activity where she introduces her students to the terms monarchy, oligarchy, dictatorship, democratic republic, communist, and theocracy. And I don't know if you're familiar with those terms before. Historically, people cover them in 9th grade civics, but maybe that was a long time ago for you. Maybe you forgot them. But Callie has defined them on the sheet that I'm giving you. I think it's important to recognize that the United Kingdom has a constitutional monarchy. A democratic republic would be the type of government for the UK, Nigeria, Mexico, and Russia. That China is a communist country and Iran is a theocracy. So within the AP6, many of these different types of countries many of these types of governments are covered. And what you're going to do for your activity is, as a group, is you guys are going to use gummy bears, and hopefully you won't eat them all before you actually use them, and whatever props you want to create a model of all 6 of these types of governments, and we will share these with each other. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.